In these sessions, we hope to probe the politics of urban design and issues of public-private space making as they relate to the global cities. And we hope to articulate, at some level, a robust new critique and defense of public space and rights to the urban in the planning of vast new districts, on the one hand, as well as in the reuse and retrofit of existing infrastructure, places, neighborhoods. It's been 22 years since the publication of Michael Sorkin's influential Variations on a Theme Park, The New American City and the End of Public Space, which was our origin point for thinking about these sessions. Professor Sorkin happens to be our colleague at the City College of New York, so we have ongoing discussions and debates with him. So the question is, what are the global legacies of that critical discourse, which was really lodged in the West, or North America, really, at that time. So to consider this, this afternoon, we will be visiting 4 global cities: Athens, Tel Aviv, Houston, and Sofia. And what I'm going to do for the session is just introduce each speaker. They're going to speak in the order that they're listed in the program. So first up is Aristodimos Komninos, who's a licensed architect engineer in Greece and holds a SMARCS degree in architecture and urbanism from MIT, also my alma mater. And he currently lives in New York and is practicing with Robert A.M. Stern Architects. So, welcome, Aristodimos.
So today I'm going to talk to you about the decommissioned International Airport of Athens, also known as Hellinikon. After giving a brief introduction to the site, I will make the case that Hellinikon is a typical example of public urban land that is exploited by forces of capitalist urbanization. And then I will explain why such an urban model is not suited for a city in crisis like Athens. And finally, I'm going to present my design proposal that questions traditional practices of urban development and brings forward a bottom-up urbanization model that I call the collective superstructure. So the site happens to be in a very privileged location in Athens, 10 kilometers south of Athens downtown, and in close proximity to the new international airport and the Piraeus port of Athens. It spans 3.5 kilometers along the Aegean Sea, and this might be the last chance of Athens to open up to the water. Hellinikon is 1 kilometer away from the foothills of the Knidos mountain, and before the construction of the airport, natural streams used to cross through the site. Hellinikon covers an area of 600 hectares, and it is as big as Masdar City and has twice the size of Central Park. In order to get a sense of scale, this is Hellinikon, and this is how it would be if we pasted Barcelona's fabric on it, and it would be home to 80,000 people. Finally, serving both as an airport for more than 60 years and a large venue for the Olympic Games of 2004, Hellinikon has inherited an important infrastructural stock, including terminals, hangars, and decommissioned sporting facilities. The site was inaugurated in 1932 and was expanding in size and cycle of operations ever since. One key moment to the expansion of the site was the construction of East Terminal building by Saarinen. And in the early 90s, the airport reached critical capacity and it has to be relocated in the east of Attica. Since that time, Hellinikon had been closed permanently for the public, except during the Olympic Games of 2004, when it was transformed into one of the largest venues in Athens. But even before its closure, there had been a great debate about the future of the site. Numerous studies and international architectural competition proposed several alternatives, with dominant the idea of a large metropolitan park. However, all plans stayed put when in 2008 the crisis hit and Hellinikon was included first and foremost in the long list of privatization that had as a goal to cover the huge national debt. And as a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, Hellinikon was sold to a Chinese-Greek investment conglomerate. So the privatization of Athens comes at a very awkward moment for Athens, because, as you may have heard, the Greek economy is not doing great lately. As a matter of fact, we're not alone. Most of the southern European countries are struggling with a humanitarian crisis that is deeply rooted in economic recession, corruption, and unemployment. On their effort to transcend economic recession, central governments are treating the public urban space as a mere vehicle for economic growth. And what that practically means for the urban space is the implementation of those typical tactics of capitalist urbanization, like relocation of undesired population and activities, deregulation and privatization of the public space, safeguarding of private investment against the interests of local communities, and generally the promotion of a civic structure that is socially exclusive. That is exactly what is happening in Hellinikon today. So the new owners of the site have promised luxurious housing, malls, casinos, marinas, and the lakes. So what is wrong with that? Well, let's start with the numbers. Mostly because of Greece's weak financial standing within the global financial market, and because of an obscure privatization process, Hellinikon was eventually sold for only $1.2 billion, which covers a minor part of the $470 billion that is the national debt. On top of that, the Greek state committed for the construction of supporting infrastructure that will cost almost 2.5 times the total revenues from selling Hellinikon. So even in standard privatization criteria, this is a very, very bad deal. But leaving those considerations aside, the presence of a high-end new urban development does not address the current social and demographic issues in Athens. So, first of all, a new urban development will crush the already collapsing real estate market in Athens. It does not address the demographic decline that is that happens both in Greece, both in a Greek and a European level, and most importantly, it doesn't intercept urgent social issues like unemployment, homelessness, and an abandoned downtown Athens. So all those facts are telling a story. They're saying that what is responsible for the urban crisis in Greece is not only the financial and demographic decline, but also the fact that new urban developments are not able and not willing to address those urgent social needs. So we need alternatives. For the past 5 years, the world has witnessed a global reaction to capitalism and a revived interest for the Lefebvrean right to the city. In Greece, of course, violent protests, but also initiatives like food distribution without intermediates and other self-organized collectives are reflecting a generalized reaction against the capitalist urban crisis. Grassroots movements are also present within the site of Hellinikon. So local communities have activated the airport in ways that show how public urban land can be used in a fair and direct way. I will briefly mention 4 major initiatives, which is a voluntary tree planting initiative where people across Athens populated the site with more than 1,000 olive trees, a community clinic that operates on a voluntary basis and offers medical care to poor and unemployed, a civil aviation museum established in one of the old terminals by employees of the Greek National Air Carrier, and finally, a self-managed urban farm that operates since 2008 and has become the symbol of resistance against the privatization plans of the government. Not surprisingly, if you notice, those 4 initiatives encompass values that surpass the scale of Hellinikon, and they express the hopes of an entire city for self-institution, open green space, social provision, and culture. But are those small-scale and spontaneous activities bold enough to address a citywide problem? This paper argues that what Athens needs more than a privatized urban paradise is a new model of urban life that is more responsible towards its citizens and the environment. And this is not possible within the capitalistic city. Therefore, the hypothesis is that in order for the existing initiatives to resist the dominance of capitalist urbanization, they need to scale up and they need to strategically occupy the entire site of Hellinikon. Therefore, I claim that a scalar shift of the existing bottom-up practices can transform Hellinikon into an autonomous new community that denounces economic growth and relies on its own resources and its self-institution. And I call this the collective superstructure, which I will explain right now. So this ambiguous title, collective and superstructure, expresses the assumption that a project on autonomy cannot happen randomly or entirely unplanned. There must be a central scheme that can predict and dictate the urban capacity of the given land. Now, the structure of this proposal has three parts: urban autonomy, social infrastructure, and environmental infrastructure. And the EU strategy that I will not cover here. So, this project pushes the idea of the self-managed urban farm to the concept of a new community whose size and shape will be based on the capacity of a given land. The agricultural production is the symbol behind the autonomous character of the collective superstructure. The production is centralized along the agricultural belt, which is a stripe of land alongside the former runway, and its role is to provide the necessary food for the survival of the community. The urban patches are the urbanization vehicles of the new community, and they are city sectors defined in size and shape in order to control growth and achieve the overall self-sufficiency. These proposals suggest the deployment of 3 urban patches that allows for a community of 7,000 people to be entirely self-sufficient on fruits and vegetables. Finally, the 3 patches are connected through the trading spine, which is making a creative use of the old runway in order to establish a central venue for social and economic interaction. Now, the Metropolitan Community Clinic that I presented before proved that even during a crisis, basic social provision is still possible with collective and voluntary work. With this as a starting point, this project envisions the expansion of this social model at an urban scale, where have-nots not only obtain access to medical care, but also housing, employment, and a safe urban environment. The community centers are key components of the social infrastructure. Those are linear structures that are built perpendicular to the direction of growth, and their role is to provide incoming settlers with basic amenities and define the general urban form. The way they do that is by establishing a water management system. So the foundations of the community centers are used as underground cisterns that collect and store surface water runoff. The water is then pumped on water towers that maintain pressurized water for the distribution across the community. Each community center also holds the necessary civic amenities like markets, schools, and manufacturing lanes. Finally, the structure of the community centers provide a defensive mechanism against eviction-like practices from aspiring investors or even the state itself. For example, interconnected rooftops can be used as a secondary pedestrian network, while water towers can be used as observatories. Like here. Now, here is an example of how the urban patch grows along with the deployment of community centers and the incremental addition of water towers that define both the shape of the city as well as the size and its capacity in population. Now, the ongoing voluntary tree planting, together with a self-managed urban farm, express the public demand for more green open spaces. This project claims that the long-anticipated metropolitan park can actually be possible through the coordinated continuation of these efforts. The landscape strategy is driven by the intention to reconnect the mountain to the waterfront, and it has a dual purpose: to provide the community with the necessary natural resources for its self-institution, and secondly, to give back to the city a truly open metropolitan park and waterfront. The strategy is divided in 5 sectors, which fluctuates from a naturalistic mountain park to landscape corridors running through the urban fabric, a large-scale metropolitan park, the agricultural belt that I presented before, a buffer park, and the waterfront. Also, due to the very dry climate of Athens and the excessive impervious surfaces of the old airport, there needs also to be a water management system that can collect, store, distribute, and purify water. Now, through the Aviation Museum, the former employees of Olympic Airways paved the way for a fertile reuse of the former airport for the existing infrastructure of the airport. And due to the limited resources of a community like that, this logic will need to be generalized. Now I will briefly just present two strategies of the reuse strategy, and the first is the waterfront. And as you can see on the diagram below, the hard surfaces of the former airport are gradually being removed as the community grows and relocated to the waterfront in order to create this system of protected ponds that transform the coast into a safe place for recreation, swimming, and even fishing. On this map, you can see the existing transportation infrastructure of the site. On the north, with the grey dots, the 2 metro station, and along the coast, the tram station. And this is the existing railway of the tram. And what this project suggests is the extension of this tram line to connect all the stations between them, and of course, the trading spine that I presented in the beginning that establishes a domestic transportation network that serves all 3 urban patches. Finally, this is a simplified diagram of how existing facilities could be repurposed for the needs of the new community. Like old baseball stadiums could be the new General Assembly buildings, the hangar could be a big cultural event facility, etc. And of course, the Shoreline building, the exhibition center, which is something that runs through all the proposals for Hellinikon that have been submitted up to now. Now, before closing this presentation, I want to really fast show you how this community could be established and grow. So, with red indicating what is active, actually it's not very red in the screen. But in the beginning, settlers would occupy existing fabric on the north of the site, where now it's a former decommissioned military base. And when the building stock depletes, squadrons will move to the interior of the site, establishing the first community centers. And as the community grows and as the patches densify, the agricultural production, the individual agricultural production, will shift towards the agricultural belt. And when the community reaches its maximum capacity and the waterfront is complete at the south, this is when the new community enters its steady state phase. So what I presented may sound like a utopian scenario, but it may as well resemble to a not so distant future. What I want you to take from this presentation today is that the use of prime urban land can no longer constitute can no longer be a vehicle to generate profit and distribute it to the people, because that model has failed us in the past. I believe that the post-crisis era should signify a holistic turn on how we perceive urban space and spatial justice. Thank you for the attention.
Okay. This paper, Negotiating Public Spaces in the World City, Nation and Global as Overlapping Spaces on Tel Aviv's Shoreline. This paper examines negotiations for social inclusion as they are manifested in bodily urban design and regulatory urban planning of Independence Park, the main gay cruising site in Israel, before and after its dramatic redesign in 2009. Independence Park is discussed here as oeuvre, or work of art, following Henri Lefebvre's influential understanding of the city as a spatial and social product formed as a result of human relationships and conflicted interests over it. Negotiations over the park as oeuvre proved transformative for the agents involved. An outcast community of global characteristics gained acceptance into national identity. A peripheral city gained the status of global city, and a nation-state critiqued for violating the transnational value of human rights granted credibility as gay rights tolerant. This case study is therefore unsettling for the sharp distinctions of the spatial categories state, city, and global that we have come to consider as alienated and competing, as suggested in analytical categories like the network society, the global city, and the queer nation. Independence Park, the main homosexual cruising site in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area and in Israel at large for the past 5 decades, was reopened in 2009 after 2 years of renovation to, quote, restore its original design. Gay representatives in City Hall promised that, quote, the park will maintain its character and return to serve for cruising. The city views the park as an important meeting place for our community. However, the renovation is commonly understood to have made cruising impossible by means of landscaping and urban design, thus returning the park to the general public. Renovation transformed the park's landscape. New lawns, children's playgrounds, lighting and open vistas, removing the shrubbery and caves that were used for hiding, exposed the center of the park. Park landscape is leveled and open from all directions, its boundaries clear, and all activities visible. The park's redesign, depicted here by gay artist Rafi Peretz as an illustration of an ideal state of inclusion, is in fact a square. Depicted in midday, none of the park's visitors is there alone. All are grouped in couples or families, and heterosexuals mixed with homosexuals. Comparison with Hannah Sarah's photography of 2003 depicting a man walking Park Lane at night is striking. Park user, landscape, and image have changed irrevocably. Cruising in the park, still claimed by bloggers to be necessary for closeted men, has become impossible. Examining park landscape before and after its redesign, I point to a dramatic change in gay self-identity and its inclusion in the city's and nation's political body. It seems the community no longer views itself as a critique of heteronormativity, but rather as a subset to be included within it. Debates within the gay community over park redesign have polled between arguments rejecting cruising, stating that, I quote, "The entire public has the right to access public space, just as we gays have the rights to access the entire city." This is by a gay representative in city council, versus laments over gay leadership, quote, "Giving up our communal territory because it represents the perverse aspects of homosexuality in order to become accepted into mainstream society." Both perspectives, nonetheless, understand the redesign as symbolically replacing the rainbow flag over Independence Park with a national flag. This illustration on the left suggests that gay community aspirations of integration extend beyond urban society to Israeli society at large. A global practice of transnational community, gay cruising is nonetheless deeply in need of concrete space in city and nation. Cruising activity in Tel Aviv, recorded since its founding in 1909, has shifted between several sites along the shoreline, pushed back to the city's margins following the ongoing development of the city. Prior to the appropriation of Independence Park in the mid-60s, cruising activity took place on several other sites along the shore. So you can see here from the south northwards. So in the teens and 20s, cruising was located in Samuel Square, and it was a subset to leisure sports and bodily exposure. In the 30s and 40s, it was located a little bit north in London Park, and it was subtext to heterosexual cruising activity and significantly to the presence of British soldiers in the city. This map is like positioning London Park as one of the sites for leisure for British soldiers. And in the 50s and 60s, a bit northwards at the Golden Stairs, which was kind of a shanty, like a shack area, and it was subtext to crime and deviation, until cruising moved to Independence Park in the 60s. Allocated in Sir Patrick Gaddis's celebrated master plan for Tel Aviv of 1925, Independence Park was to serve as the city's main urban park. Yet it housed a British Army camp till 1948. The park was named after Israel's 1948 coming of statehood, reflecting the sense that a city's large urban park is not only of the city, but also of the nation. Located in a residential neighborhood and facing the Mediterranean, the park served the general public as a circle in gesture. The park is here. The shift in park use involved the construction of the Hilton Hotel in its center in the early 60s. The political and economic significance of the Hilton in the global context of the Cold War enabled Hilton representatives to claim this public park by applying pressure on the city via state government. While closed for construction, the park drew cruising activity pushed north from Golden Stairs, and when it reopened, the park was already recognized as a site for sexuality, and the public refrained from using it. Independence Park served as a main gay cruising site for 5 decades. While serving a number of activities including activism and socialization, it was arguably shaped by the fact of its 24/7 use for explicit sexual activities. Hollows within the bushes, narrow paths transcending the park's layout, and unplanned uses of park structures, particularly the public toilets and monuments. Bodies sneaking in and out formed many informal paths that permitted entering the park unobserved. This form of bottom-up urban design, resulting from the constant movement of bodies, effectively appropriated the park and marked it gay territory. Performance of bodily variations on the proper image of the good national citizen marked the park a site of gendered critique of the heterosexual male and its domain over urban and national space. Cruising activity in the park is based on sexual desirability and thereby crosses all social, ethnic, and class divisions relevant outside the park. It thereby generates intimate interactions among men from unlikely social groups. As Kobi, a Jewish religious scientist from the larger metropolitan area, told me, I quote, "One of the thrills here, I have to admit this, is having sex or just talking to someone who is so very different from me, except for being a homo, that is. Differences you cannot get past in the bar or web scenes, you can transcend here. I had something you can call a relationship with someone from Ramla, a Muslim Arab with no high school diploma, a Palestinian national activist. Both of us would never have considered it elsewhere." The city responded in attempts to drive cruising out by closing down the public toilets, installing high voltage lighting, which is like in stadiums, trimming the dense bushes, and several urban planning schemes intended to open the park and limit its use for cruising. Yet, unlike the quiet folding down of cruising activity before, attempts to drive out cruising from Independence Park in the 90s were faced with strong opposition by the now organized gay community. Struggles over the park required the community to organize and politicize, electing gay representatives for city council, entering legal suits against the city and the police, and organizing public protests against attempts to clean the city out of homosexuality. Political activity in defense of the park as territory generated impressive public consensus that homosexuality is indeed part of the city and Israeli society. Tel Aviv embraced the global nature of gay identity and community in its attempt to brand as a global city, a space of flow on the network society. The city invests great efforts in celebrating its gay-friendly global identity and in attracting global gay tourism. This is the gay tourism page on the Tel Aviv formal website, and there are all kinds of events like painting pedestrian crossings, rainbow, and this is not photoshopped. So over the years, homosexuality has been acknowledged as a legitimate variant of the Israeli, even by such homophobic institutions as the Israel Defense Forces. This is the former Facebook page of the IDF from Gay Pride Day last year. Furthermore, the relative freedom and integration of gays in national society and institutions is presented by the State of Israel in its foreign publications in an attempt to rebrand as a tolerant first world nation state. This is from the Israeli Embassy in London webpage last year. In this context, the park's transformative redesign between 2007 and 2009, not only permitted by the gay community but even welcomed by it, should be examined as a change of policy made by a politically organized community in the city. Letting go of Independence Park as an appropriated territory is stating that gays no longer require a separate territory for a separate identity. And I'm quoting a gay community leader and member of city council saying, "Use of public park for sex does not respect any man. Independence Park's historical role as a site of refuge and casual sex has ended, and it is about to become a beautiful public park." So I'd like to conclude by saying a few words about the interplay of global city and nation as overlapping Oeuvres. Homosexual cruising is not specific to Tel Aviv or to Israel, but rather explicitly connected to the global gay nation and to urban sites in other cities and nations. Nonetheless, examining the transformation of Tel Aviv's Independence Park suggests that negotiations over this park for inclusion in city and nation explicitly conflates the urban, the global, and the national, which we tend to understand and in the literature as alienated and competing with each other. So I'd like to ask, what is at stake in the struggle over urban spaces beyond the scope of the city, especially in a city aspiring to become a global city, which is also located in a nation-state going through an ongoing spatial conflict. If spatial oeuvres overlap, as suggested here, reconceptualization of social space is required. Thank you.
So I have to first say that many of the photographs included here were done by Paul Hester, who's a local Houston photographer. I didn't put his name on everyone that he's taken, but it's quite a number. Today, the interesting thing I'm finding is that we're all talking about these kind of large sites, either public or private, that are opportunities for change or have changed. I'm going to talk today about multifamily housing in Houston, circa 1970s, if you will. While the old public housing projects in cities like Chicago have been demolished, what we're fundamentally seeing is the reemergence of a private type of projects, if you will, what I like to call the new projects in the periphery of our cities. This is, caused from disinvestment, from changing demographics, changing desires, so on and so forth. So the difference is, though, is that the new projects were built for young professionals who lived alone. They had very few kind of amenities or anything like that, and now they're increasingly home to people with children, to families, and increasingly home to people who live below the poverty line. In Houston, there's 315,000 apartments that are housed in buildings of 10 or more units. 40% of this was built between 1960 and 1979. And across the United States, 1/3 of all rental housing in the United States was built between 60 and 79. One of the reasons is because there were incentives at that time to build multifamily, and so it ended up getting built kind of everywhere. So one of the challenges today is that this housing is, for the most part, our largest kind of collection of affordable housing in the United States. The other part of it, but it's not enough. It's not enough anywhere in the United States overall. For every 100 extremely low income people, which means you make less than 20,000 families, you make less than 20,000, there's about 30 affordable housing units for them. In Houston, it's 17 for every 100 people who need one. So what's happened in Houston, this is a map of multifamily housing in Houston. So the other thing is that as housing has aged, particularly the 1970s version of housing, it was not built originally to last very long. In other words, 30 years was kind of what you projected forward, and kind of the idea that it would kind of continue to be here and continue to serve people, particularly more people in each unit. And so 60% of all of the multifamily housing in Houston is located in the southwest side. The rings represent Houston's ring freeways. There's one more coming, we're not done yet. But you can see it's all outside, it's all on the periphery. And so I want to talk a little bit about scale, because I think this is one thing that holds, in some ways, some of the projects together. At the neighborhood scale, multifamily housing are often sitting on sites, in Houston anyway, sitting on sites that are at least 10 acres. And so they're isolated. They're disconnected from the surrounding city. They're islands, if you will. They're privatized landscapes. At the scale of the complex, parking is the most, I would say, the most prominent landscape features you can see here. And open space is, in most cases, undefined. It's, in most cases, very small. And where there is green space, it often doesn't belong to anyone, so it just kind of leaks out and nobody claims it, and so it's not well used. We've seen it, with the kind of funny apartment buildings and nobody owns the property. It's the same thing that happened in public housing when we built the towers. And so It's also, this shows downtown Houston and at the same scale as a single block engulfed in, or a single complex. So you can see that 16 downtown blocks would fit in that one block there engulfed in. And so there's also this question of, so this is a typical multifamily housing complex in Houston from the 1970s. The complexes, the way that they're working and the way they were intended to work, they weren't intended for people to organize, for people to have kind of a civic life, or for them to be kind of part of a strong community. Does that make sense? These are for people who are going to kind of live here when they're young, professional, and then they were going to move out. But this is all changing. And so I think that one of the things I was really interested in is how do you get that sense of kind of ownership and control in a place that you're renting, one, in the United States, which is very difficult, but two, and how do you get the sense of kind of spatial agency? In other words, what can people do to create change? And that's what I'm gonna try to talk about today. So here's just, I just wanted to kind of zoom in and show the scale. Gating is everywhere in 1970s apartments in Houston. There's not a single one that's not gated. And no one's going to be the first one to take it down, which is, I think, a problem. I want to talk a little bit about housing policy. In other words, how did we get here? And so in 1937, the Wagner-Steagall Act was passed. It created the first opportunity in the United States to build public housing. In 1949, the Housing Act was passed, which meant we actually would build public housing, and we did. Following the 1949 Act, I think about 800,000 units were constructed, or were at least planned to be constructed. In 1972, Richard Nixon put a moratorium on the construction of new public housing. And then, of course, in 1992, President Clinton passed the Hope 6 program, which to demolish old public housing and replace it with mixed income neighborhoods. So at this point, the housing choice voucher system, which is where you have a voucher and you go out into the market and you purchase your housing on the private market, is the biggest, it's not just the largest, it is the predominant form of housing subsidy in the United States. 2.1 million families rely on housing vouchers in the United States. The intent was that it was going to lead to a deconcentration of poverty. But what's happened is, as our cities, particularly urban areas, have gotten more valuable, as the gap between the rich and the poor has widened, meaning we're also widening the distance between where we live. So the rich are in one place and the poor are another. And so the voucher at this point is leading to a reconcentration of poverty, and that's not different from what we saw happening in the 1960s. Oh, and then I just wanted to say that in Houston in 2012, the waiting list for 20,000 vouchers that were going to become available opened for the first time in 6 years. 83,000 families applied for those 20,000 places on a waiting list. So 45% of all rental housing in the United States is concentrated in poor neighborhoods. So this just says something about that distinction. And so the other issue, and this is one of the reasons why I've started, this is an issue I've been looking at for a long time, but I'm trying to get a little bit deeper, because 13% of all rental units that are affordable, meaning they rent for $400 a month, were demolished in the 10 years between 2000 and 2011. In Houston, the idea is that they all need to be demolished, that that's the solution, that we should demolish the 140,000 units of apartments, because that's the only way to solve it. And so I want to talk about three complexes specifically to provide, I think, kind of insight into what's possible and maybe not so much what human agency can do. That's StCloud. And then I'm going to talk about Taiwan Village, which is a much different kind of situation. And then I'm going to talk about a complex in Greenspoint where really nothing has changed at this point. So StCloud is in a neighborhood called Gulfton. Gulfton is the densest neighborhood in Houston, by far has the highest population density of any community. In the 1970s, 15,000 apartments were built in the less than 3 square mile area, and that's really all that's there. 60% of residents in Gulfton were born outside the United States. Poverty sits at 39% of the population. I have to say, this is a soccer field, and I don't know if you can see the pool. So the complex once had 4 pools. All of them have been filled in, and the management has put this fence up so kids can play soccer without breaking everybody's windows. So to try to kind of deal with it. StCloud is mostly home to ethnic Nepalese immigrants from Bhutan. Houston has a lot of resettlement agencies, and oftentimes these same apartments are used for those same purposes. This StCloud is one of those cases. And so StCloud is 272 units on 8.6 acres, about 32 units per acre. Again, a filled-in pool in the center. It has a repeating rhythm of kind of courtyard, building, parking lot, building, courtyard, building, parking lot. The apartments open both to the front and the back. And I think in many ways that this has created the kind of ability for people to kind of see one another and watch one another, and so there's this sense of community that's happened here. Gulfton is also a pretty dangerous neighborhood, just so you know, and this complex is extraordinarily safe. They tell me there's no crime there or any other thing. So what I'm trying to get to is kind of how is it that this one complex is working so well while others kind of disintegrate, if you will. So here's the pattern of kind of courtyard, building, and parking. There's very little open space, and I have to say that Gulfton probably has least open space of any neighborhood in Houston. 30 acres for about 70,000 people. It's pretty horrible. So kids play in the courtyard about 40 feet wide, baseball, whatever. Some courtyards are fenced, others are not, as you can see. So I think that the whole idea is that, for me, StCloud is a place that is working. And it's not working because designers have interfered. It's working actually because the community has kind of come together and kind of made it work for them. One of the things that's happened is that the management company is supporting it. And so but it's also, there's 2 community centers that are in vacant apartments, and one of the things that we're finding is that more and more community organizations are moving into complexes like they moved into the inner city in the 1960s and the 1970s. Does that make sense? Nonprofit organizations providing after-school programming, language classes, so on and so forth. So I want to talk just a little bit about Taiwan Village. Taiwan Village is on the way to Hobby Airport in South Houston. Taiwan Village is a little bit different than StCloud in the sense that the folks who live at Taiwan Village, they own their units. $5,000 to $10,000 is their appraised value, each unit. About 40% of area residents were born outside the U.S. Poverty is at about 32%. Taiwan Village is almost entirely Vietnamese. It was bought by a Catholic priest in the 1970s, and he brought immigrants to live in the complex, and then the complex was sold. And so Taiwan Village has very little open space, not unlike StCloud. 224 units, built in 1976. And sitting on 5.6 acres. Like StCloud, the one pool has been filled in. And so where the pool, and this is actually in the courtyard where the pool is, this is the filled-in pool. And then the worship space in the center of the complex. The entire landscape has been redefined. In many ways, I think of it as being kind of one part J.G. Ballard's Supercons and one part, Herbert Gahn's Urban Villagers. It's this kind of collision of this kind of suburban kind of landscape with significant adaptation and change, and it feels like it should be Boston, like the North End in the 1940s, but it's in an apartment complex, and so people farm and have gardens, and there's a store and a number of other small businesses inside. Everyone owns, so people have kind of made adjustments. And this is a quote from the Houston Press. I'm not going to read it, but it was really talking about the fact that there's something so incredibly beautiful about how Taiwan Village works. It's not unlike StCloud. And so one of the things I'm trying to figure out is that are there lessons here in terms of spatial agencies and people's capacity to organize that might make sense where it's not working so well. So with that, I'm going to talk about Greenspoint. And so I loved your map with Barcelona in it. So this is downtown Houston in one block in Greenspoint, just so you can see the scale of the neighborhood. Greenspoint has 11,000 apartments. One guy, Steve Moore, I call him the fixer, owns 25% of all those apartments, or 2,700 units. I'll talk about him a little bit later. In 1990, Greenspoint had 2,500 people under the age of 18. By 2000, it had gone up to 12,000. By 2010, it had gone up to 14,000. So that's fact of how many families are now living in 1970s apartments, because no other buildings have been built in Greenspoint. Excellent. 36% of the population are children. Went the wrong way, sorry. The poverty rate is 36% in the neighborhood. In many of the complexes, it's hovering around 50. So the idea in Greenspoint has been that what we'll do is we'll just try to change it. And so the fixer, the apartment owner, that's what he wants to do. He has policies where you can't have baggy pants, your underwear showing, or skimpy clothing. And he's moved into the complex, and he's basically evicting everyone who's a problem. So this is a sign at Greenspoint Mall, which serves the neighborhood. But one of the things that is happening in Greenspoint is so the first time I saw like a really badass rap video with apartments in the background, I was like, what? From the 1970s, very, very American, sprawl-based kind of stuff. And Greenspoint has its own scene, and people identify basically based on their apartment complex. So it's like 181 Goodson or Imperial Valley, which is very interesting. No more blocks and things like that. So here's just some images from some of the music that's coming out of Greenspoint. I don't want to talk about this. I want to wrap up because I'm running out of time. But one of the things that we're finding is that people are incredibly resilient. And you want to talk about urban farming. This is a farm in Houston. It's run by an organization called Planet Forward in a utility easement. Way out west in a neighborhood called Braes Oaks, and it's farmed by mostly immigrants from the Congo, and there's one other country, and I'm missing it, and I'm sorry. But 2 African countries. People are paid to farm here. They are not farming for free. The whole idea of this kind of beautiful community garden stuff, we gotta stop it, because you have to have people who want to garden. And the organization here, they have this beautiful post on their website. They said, we have a lot of immigrants who have a lot of farming experience in our city, which we do. Houston has an abundance of vacant land, and people are clamoring for locally grown produce. I'm not sure that they meant grown in the utility easement, but nonetheless. And so I wanted to end here because this neighborhood was actually the one in all these images, Braes Oaks. It's home to one of the highest concentrations of multifamily housing, and that's where the people who are farming this landscape live, are in the apartments right behind it. So I guess I just want to end by saying that I feel like the mistakes that we made with 1970s apartments in terms of kind of building them as islands separated from the context, we're doing the same thing with higher density housing. We're not kind of thinking about its adaptability or its kind of potential to be transformed or to have new users. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we need to build cities that are literally resilient in terms of kind of usability, in other words, of how spaces actually can adapt and change, because I suspect that the high density we're building in the center of cities will one day again be home to families. So, thank you.
So, thank you, June and Nandini, for allowing me to be part of this very exciting panel. I think we all here because we do share a belief in the importance of public space. And this is not a belief that's based only on the fact that we simply like the way it looks or the way it is, but I think we share a belief that certain values and behaviors are shaped by the spaces we live in, and a functioning, accessible, open public space is, as some scholars have said, an essential precondition for building a public world, and that the lack of it potentially could lead us, again, as others have said, to perhaps a trained-in capacity to perform in the public realm. Now, the connection between public space and the public realm as a social arena, I don't want to imply that this is direct and straightforward. There are a number of probably thousands of examples in human history where public spaces were controlled not with any sort of a democratic goal in mind, but because this is where executions were performed, this is where people were supposed to celebrate those who governed them, and so forth and so forth. So simply that you have public space does not necessarily mean that you also have a democratic public realm whatsoever. But one way or another, I think scholars do agree that there is something, I think I'm citing here James Halston, there is something irreducible and untransferable, necessary if not quite sufficient, about the city's public street and square for the realization of a meaningfully democratic citizenship. Now, the region of the world that I'm coming from, which is Eastern Europe, most of my photographs are from Sofia, but you also see Belgrade and Zagreb and Moscow and Tirana, is that this commitment to public space was an extremely strong ideological imperative that the socialist regimes tried to impose over these cities. And this is a 1930s, I believe, poster from Moscow, which shows, as they saw it at the time, how the formerly commercial city, a city which is made of many competing private interests, was going to be transformed in a place which is socialist Moscow, where people will join and celebrate the public realm. And the disciplinary and controlling aspects of this idea, of course, are obvious to all. Many of these public spaces were actually built, especially in the countries of Central East Europe, which joined the Soviet socialist world after World War II, through very, authoritarian measures. You can see how, there were small buildings of various kinds, the infamous private interests, which are in the process of demolition to build the houses of the communist parties and the various other institutions with the red star on top. This on this side of the slide is actually President Tito, who is building a whole new neighborhood in Belgrade. And these kinds of things would happen with incredible speed and intensity in socialist conditions because of the near full control that the regimes had over the production of space, the power that sort of planners in capitalist conditions could only dream of. And here and there they were able to do that, for example, in Brasilia. But the massiveness, the intensity, and the ideological commitment to public space, I would argue, was probably unprecedented in the socialist world as opposed to others during the mid-20th century. These kinds of projects are very prominent ways of reconstructing Central and East European cities in the 50s. Of course, many of those cities had major demolitions because of and destruction because of World War II. But even in cities that were did not experience such demolitions, the construction of these spaces was a very prominent part of the initial build-up of the socialist state. In only a few countries, such projects continued through the 80s. You might recognize this is a very famous building. This is the second largest public building in the world. After the Pentagon is the People's Palace in Bucharest, which, by the way, during the 1980s, one of the most massive demolitions of the urban fabric in the 20th century. And many of this is just the culmination of a very large project of very ceremonial boulevards and plazas that were made to make Bucharest sort of outdo Paris at the time. So this sort of a spatial megalomania, if I may say, imposed through very rigid top-down measures, was true for downtowns. It was also true for the periphery of cities. This is a slide from Zagreb, which, it's not a very big city to begin with. The sort of a massivity of space is completely unprecedented in the history of a city of this size. And you can see just the monumentality of public space where people were supposed to exchange idea and thrive. And this was the place where this mythically selfless socialist men and women were going to prosper. And these are going to be people who will be completely immune from petty private interests and going to selflessly contribute to society, something which, of course, did not happen. But although it did not happen, this is sort of a bare picture, but as a matter of fact, these places did become very vibrant spaces no matter what the intent was to begin with. And the massivity of these public spaces certainly outdid what these cities had before the beginning of the socialist era. Some just simple statistics, if you compare Budapest and Vienna, which until the early 20th century were part of the same empire, they probably, I haven't researched yet, probably similar amounts of public space per person. By the end of the 1980s, Budapest public space per person, openly accessible space, was 4 times what you had in Vienna. So massive investments in many of these cities. Whatever you had until about 1945 in terms of public space per person became 20 times larger than it was. So in 1990 as compared to 1944. So monumental investment in public space, probably because that's, it was to an extent to project legitimacy. Here, this is what we gave you, this is what the regime could build, not what you had before. Control, undoubtedly, but ultimately, also something that people actually used and learned to love, and where people crossed various distinctions traditional distinctions along class or ethnicity that existed in the past. So the project was very, very intentional. This is kind of an archetypical building. This is in Belgrade. I mean, the scale of it is amazing if you look at the existing urban fabric. And the idea obviously here is a very collectivist spirit that is projected. Everybody is living in a unit that looks like everybody else's unit, but you also had an amazing class mixture. So these are not like the projects in the United States. You had from painter to poet, the entire almost socialist intelligentsia, along with the working classes sort of mixing together. And the units were, depending on the country, relatively small, which only emphasized the extent to which the public spaces were grand. And this was partially done for economic reasons because, these were countries that were poorer than West European countries. They had a lot of urban migration, and they had to house people without allowing them to live in slums, because that would be totally, of course, unbefitting. But also there was a very strong ideological commitment to shrinking private space and expanding the public sphere, to the point that, not joking, in the 1930s, there is actually serious debates in the Soviet planning and architectural literature whether on purpose, not for economic reasons, on purpose, units should be constructed without a kitchen in the future, just so that people and families learn that this kind of activity is something that we should all share. So it should be a public activity as opposed to something that confines the household to a spatial realm. And by the way, a lot of this had to do, at the time at least, in various plans and documents that were put together, with the liberation of women. Going back to Soviet literature from 1917, women were enslaved by the kitchen. If you get the kitchen out of the home, you actually will reach women's liberation, which did not quite happen, but progress was made. And again, these spaces, as they may look a little bare and not remarkable, people learn to live them and love them and communicate. And over time, I think the original totalitarian function was to a great extent lost, to the point that many of the revolutions, the Velvet Revolutions, actually started in the very same public spaces that the communist regimes had built so that they can be celebrated in public. So what happens in the 1990s is in the early 1990s, what I call in my paper is a perfect storm of preconditions of the complete, not complete, but nearly complete vanishing of the public spaces that socialism left. And this is kind of a few slides from the early 1990s. This is what's happening. So not the most beautiful, but it is what it is. So you can see these were, the great disciplined buildings from the past, and these are these informal new buildings. People are selling something, they're living there. People just begin building. At the time, often this was called do-it-yourself urbanism. People built houses in front of them. I mean, who would stop me? There are economic reasons for this because these spaces were privatized. There were also some institutional reasons because institutions, they just stopped issuing building permits. They just stopped dealing with this kind of, because it was too minor. There were way too many other problems. Plus, it was viewed at the time widely that whatever the markets demand, that must be for the best. So these kinds of buildings were built all over, to the point that entire neighborhoods were constructed on public land. Who got a permit, who didn't get a permit, I don't know. This is Belgrade. So 20 years would pass and then they would legitimize it in the master plan. This is Tirana, again, to my knowledge. This is completely spontaneous process in which people are, in essence, building their own city as they wish, which obviously has some problems. Entire layers of the urban fabric are constructed. You can see, you don't have to know anything about this world region. I can tell you exactly where the year 1990 is. Okay, this is the year 1990. So everything that was built in a kind of disciplined, organized fashion is built before, and everything that's kind of mixed and everybody built whatever their heart desires, sort of the new freedom, is built after. One of the most paradigmatic features is that people began to gate their homes. Kind of a little bit of a higher class building here, nestled between the socialist buildings. You can see actually the very first thing, you can't see, but the fact is that the first thing they built is the gate. As things move on, people, especially elites, begin moving toward the periphery, and then you have these really threatening gated compounds, to the point where in some cities, 90% of the urban fabric constructed in suburban areas is actually with a wall like this and have guards, and so forth and so forth. I'm not joking here. These are the gates of a single family home, newly constructed. This is not an old building, whole communities. And sort of the traditional way in which people did their daily business, which would be this. This is from Belgrade. You can see kind of very interactive late 19th century environment. People would do their shopping, was replaced with new commercial ways of doing business, which would be this from the very same city. And at this point of time, this is about the year 2000, kind of paradigm shift from what in the 90s used to be called do-it-yourself urbanism to what is called investor urbanism. So these are big scale, often multinationals who are coming to build new areas. This does not seem like, what's private about this. A German chain Hirt, it's like Walmart. And if you can see, actually it has a fence, they close it. So even this, place where people shop for groceries actually has a little guard on all sides. And it says welcome, but, also pay attention. We work for you. Malls, in Sofia alone, I think they one of the more malls per person than any European city. Some of them are in the urban fabric, some are outside. And just very quickly to introduce you with the two largest private urban districts that were built in this city. One is Residential Park Sofia, and this is from their website. And this is about 2,000 units, which is very big for this city, completely new development, in which to enter, and that's the other one, I don't have actually more slides from this, to enter this community, it's actually the very same process which happens at the border between Bulgaria and Greece. Both countries are part of the European Union. It's not very difficult to move from one from another, but it's the same thing. You have to show an ID. the guard makes a copy of the ID, and you have to briefly state the purpose of your visit. So it's a very, very controlled environment. And the other one is Business Park Sofia, which is allowed to be, it doesn't look that threatening or private, but it's the largest, they call it, public space in the city. The part of it that's not quite public is that it actually also has gates. And my interviews with the guards say that people actually use something which is called face control. So if you don't appear to be part of the respectable public, they can deny you a visit. So these kinds of urban public spaces, I don't know whether I should call them public, urban spaces, but not public spaces, have very much become the new norm and the new face of this investor urbanism. Here and there is some resistance, but not too much. And just to give you an indication to which they are seen as the new norm and a new desirable norm, is that the person who is behind, who kind of invented those two districts, who was the mind behind the developer. Both of them are built by German firms, designed by German architects, and so forth and so forth. But there is a local businessman who actually envisioned them, was the manager, and acquired great reputation. So great is his reputation in doing those places successfully that he became president of the country, and actually with very high approval ratings. So this whole idea of actually the private city at the periphery very much acquired, the legitimacy that perhaps we as architects and planners would like that it did not. Thank you.